Chapter 12, we'll be talking about the principles of test selection administration. So, within this chapter, pay close attention to the two most important concepts, that is, test validity and test reliability. Okay, validity is the test valid? Is it actually measuring what it is that you want to measure? And reliable is looking at how consistent is the test you're doing. Are you getting numbers that are close together and follow a certain pattern, or are they all over the place? Okay, because you don't want to be collecting data on athletes if it's not going to be measuring what it is you want to measure and then giving you consistent, reliable numbers. Because the goal of testing and administration is that you're trying to get an idea of where your athletes are at. Okay, you're looking at their abilities. What are the attributes? What can you work on? Where can you make progress? Because the goal is to make sure, when you get into strength and conditioning, is you want to fine tune the programming to hit the specific needs of the athlete. And so the only way to do that is get an idea of where they stand in strength, endurance, power, agility, and all those factors. That way you could get an idea, develop a program, and then going through the program, then retest again to see, all right, how effective was my program? Okay, and then make adjustments. Keep making it so they could keep progressing and keep growing, keep developing. Okay, so just make sure in this chapter know the overall concepts, the definitions, validity, reliability, and why it is that we test and monitor and evaluate our athletes. Chapter 12, Principles of Test Selection and Administration. So going back to the purpose of this chapter, well, we want to get into why it is that we are testing athletes. Okay, so within this, you need to know, okay, what's the reason for performing tests? And what's the reason for performing specific tests? Not all tests are going to be applicable to all athletes. So we need to kind of know, why are we testing, the reason behind the test, and to be able to know which ones are best suited for each individual athlete. So know the terminology. That way you could clearly communicate with athletes and their colleagues, especially as a strength coach. For the most part, what tests are appropriate for athletes. However, the athlete may not know, and the sport coaches may not know. And so you need to be able to explain to all those around you, hey, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it. Each test should have some form of validity and reliability. Validity is being, what you're testing is actually going to tell you what you want to know. So how valid is the test? And reliability is, can it be reproducible? And so we'll define those further coming up here in a bit. So make sure you know each test validity and reliability, know how to select the appropriate test, and of course, how to administer properly. So a lot of athletes, a lot of data can be collected but it'd be collected improperly, just due in part to failure of the administrator, the tester, not, selecting the appropriate test, too much variation in each individual tester's ability to collect the data. So it's kind of both fronts there. You need to know what's going on, but you also need to make sure that you are clearly and appropriately administering the test and getting the information that you need from the testing itself. So reasons for testing. So it helps athletes and coaches assess athletic talent and physical abilities, along with areas in need of improvement. Allows coaches to set specific goals for individual athletes that help to accomplish group or team objectives. And provides a way to determine if a candidate has the needed physical or basic physical abilities that, in combination with technique, training, practice, can produce a competitive player. Okay, we see testing from all levels, from high school all the way up to the professional level. Okay, think of the professional, if we're going to the football, you got the combine. Those are a series of tests, all selected to test specific attributes of a football player. Okay, but why do we test? Well, one, That's going to the pros, but even in high school, we do testing to see, 1RM testing, vertical jump, 40-yard dash. You got the T drill. You've got other agility drills for, amongst all the different sports. And it gives the coach an idea of where the athlete's at. Because the reality is, and we're looking at validity, reliability, we're looking at all these factors going into testing. Well, we know that those athletes that are stronger tend to always be a better athlete. Weaker athletes are not going to be as good as stronger athletes. So there's a reason why you could look at an athlete and go, all right, this person's stronger, faster, etc. There's a good chance then, with the right coaching, develop the technique to produce the best athlete possible. So it's not always the case. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen people from our high school that were the strongest and fastest, but not necessarily always the best. But, for the most part, though, those who are the strongest and fastest will be the better athlete. Okay, obviously, coaching, ability to learn as an athlete, all those factors do come into play as well to overall athletic performance. However, there's a reason why we test, because it gives the coach an idea of, okay, what kind of athletes do I have to work with? It says to identify physical abilities in need of improvement. Well, it allows the coach to kind of know what they need to work on. And so helps them then from that point to, you can see, testing measures and analysis can determine which physical qualities of an athlete can be targeted, prescribed exercise programs. So it gives you an idea of all right, well, we need to work on this. We need to work on that. So then you can start tailoring the program to help to identify those needs, which then goes into that last point, or the second last point, set goals. It's important that you always have goals you set and you strive for, tangible goals as well. All right, if you're coming in and you're bench pressing 200 pounds, it would not be a good idea to say, in the next year I want to bench 400 pounds. However, you need to set some tangible goals of, all right, well, let's try and increase, if you're coming in as let's say a freshman in high school and you're bench 200 pounds, well, tangible goals within a year, maybe bench, 225 one time, you don't want to set too high goals, but you also don't want to set too low goals, but something somewhat tangible, maybe like 225, 250, within a year, add 50 pounds to the bench, especially at that age group. It's not hard because they're going through puberty and their changes, so they could probably put on some muscle mass and some strength. But point being, make sure you set tangible goals that you could reach, but you need to set goals. And of course, evaluate the progress. Okay, do assessments throughout to make sure that what you're doing is actually being accomplished. Okay, you don't have to do 1RM testing every month, but make note of your athletes. All right, well, they're doing this prescribed right here, and they're getting more reps when I tell them, do 5 reps, and they're able to do 7, 8 reps. Well, okay, readjust. Okay, let's say add more weight. Readjust the intensity. Something along those lines, that you're constantly adding that stimulus to your athletes. Key terms. So a test, a procedure for assessing ability in a particular endeavor. Then you got field test, a test used to assess ability that's performed away from the lab and does not require extensive training or expensive equipment. Okay, a lot of things as a strength coach you will be doing is not in the laboratory. In fact, pretty much everything will not be in the laboratory. Everything will be field-based, which in a lot of ways is very applicable to the athlete. I mean, like doing a 40-yard dash, testing the 40-yard speed is a lot more applicable than having somebody on a treadmill doing a VO2 max test. Okay, so the field tests are good because it's really more along the lines of what the athlete's actually doing. You got measurement, the process of collecting test data, evaluation, process of analyzing test results for the purpose of making decisions. You have a mid-test, tests administered 1 or more times during a training period to assess progress and modify a program as needed to maximize benefit. Formative evaluation, periodic reevaluation based on mid-test administration during the training, usually at regular intervals, and the post-test. Tests administered after the training period to determine the success of the training program in achieving the training objectives. Okay, these are all just kind of what most coaches do anyway. They're going to do one RM test, do training, and then at the end of the training, right before the season, they'll do another 1 RM to see, what were their improvements. Okay. So then you get to validity. Kind of stated a little bit already, but the degree to which a test or test item measures what it is supposed to measure. This is one of the most important characteristics of testing, is looking at, well, are you actually measuring what, or is the test actually measuring what you're supposed to be measuring? Okay, so one example would be 1 RM testing. That's a valid test for overall strength. 1.5 mile run is a valid test for aerobic endurance. Push-up test, one you could argue is not very much of, especially like for military purposes. They always do the push-up test as a test of muscle strength. However, when they tell you to do as many push-ups as possible, that is a definition of endurance. So really, push-up test should be redefined as a muscle endurance test, not a muscle strength. And so there's been a lot of push to try and revamp the selection process for going in the military to try and start testing more along the lines of these actual qualities, actual strength, not, just because the problem is military's done push-ups as a test of strength since the beginning. So, they're not going to change now. But so just make sure when you're testing that it's actually measuring what it's supposed to measure. So it's broken up a little bit further. You got construct validity. So this is the ability of a test to represent the underlying construct, the theory developed to organize and explain some aspects of existing knowledge and observations. So this is really more along the lines of, really, this is the overall validity. Construct validity is basically the testing what it's supposed to be testing. You have face validity, so appearance to an athlete and other casual observers that the test measures what is supposed to be measured. Sometimes this is non-quantitative, and you're just kind of letting the athlete, or you're collecting measurements without them really kind of, knowing exactly what you're looking at. Then you have content validity. It says the assessment by experts that the test covers all relevant subtopics or component abilities and appropriations. Some sports, for instance, you might have a battery of tests, and you might have a agility test, a strength test, endurance test, speed test, power test. The book talked about using soccer as a good example. So a soccer player might have a series of tests looking at their jumping, sprinting, and then like a kicking test to see their overall power. And so essentially content validity is that if you're trying to get the overall of the athlete, that every part of the testing is going to cover all topics, or all components of the athlete's abilities. You just want to make sure each one is valid for each specific attribute, which then gets into the overall profile of the player. You got criterion reference validity. This is the extent to which the test scores are associated with some other measure of the same ability. And that's broken up into the next three. You got concurrent validity. So this extent to which test scores are associated with those of other accepted tests measuring the same ability. Concurrent would be the book used example of a correlation. So kind of looking at body fat testing and looking at, they talk about like a new body testing device and how correlated it is over with like a DEXA scan. And so what you're looking at is trying to get that the validity of that associated with the validity of the DEXA scan. So look at them concurrently together. Then you got predictive validity. It's the extent to which the test score corresponds to future performance or behavior. So when you're looking at predictive, it's if you're looking at jumping power, be a good one. So those who have a higher vertical jump could give you a good predictive, because a vertical jump is a valid test for overall lower body power. And so those who have a high vertical jump, then you could predict that, saying like they're probably going to be a good sprinter. Okay, so there's a correlation there of lower body power on the vertical jump and strength and overall explosiveness. So you can say, well, if they're going to have a high vertical jump, they'll probably be a good sprinter. Then you got discriminant validity. So the ability of a test to distinguish between two different constructs. And so this would be looking at number of tests that might not interfere with one another. So they should have an independent relation to one another. So maybe like flexibility and aerobic endurance. Supplement testing those together because they're independent of each other in terms of, well, the factors that go into good, flexibility, good aerobic performance are not necessarily the same for one another. So basically, you're not going to impede upon that testing, because we'll see coming up here in a bit with test selection, you want to make sure to select tests in an appropriate manner. So you don't want to kind of be doing a number of tests that are going to majorly interfere with one another. Okay, next you got reliability. So it's a measure of the degree of consistency or repeatability of a test. So reliability of a test may differ between groups based on differences in physical or emotional maturity and skill level. And so when you're looking at a reliable test, one point, the book used a good example of the 1.5 mile run is a good reliable test for aerobic fitness. Just like the 40-yard sprint, weightlifting is a good reliable test for anaerobic or for strength. And so those would be ones that are both valid and reliable for those given areas. So make sure when you're testing that you're looking at tests that can be reproduced. Okay, and that's why we have these standards for testing strength, for testing aerobic fitness, flexibility, and so forth, because you could repeat them. And you could repeat them for the most part with accuracy. And that's the problem, is you want to make sure that it comes down to that accuracy right there. Are you actually able to measure what it is you're measuring? And it talks about a consistent manner. So if you're getting numbers all over the place, well, that's not going to really tell you anything what you need to know about your testing. Okay, so just make sure that when you're testing, it's valid and it's reproducible or reliable, that is repeatable. Like that last point says, a test must be reliable because highly variable results have little meaning. So some errors that do occur, you got intra-subject, so within subjects variability. You'll see this a lot in testing all the time. Subjects one day will give you all they can, and next day the next time they come in the session, hardly give you any effort at all. So it does throw off your data, especially in research, quite a bit. So then you got lack of inter-rater reliability, or agreement. So between raters. So it's a good idea if you're having one person testing an athlete, make sure that same person tests that same athlete all throughout. Okay, so if you're just collecting weight, that's not a problem. Height and weight on athletes, that's one thing. But I'm saying, like, if you're doing some more complex testing, especially looking at technique for Olympic lifting, or if you're timing athletes with a stopwatch, things of that nature, where you need to be specific. Well, whoever have the same tester test the same person throughout the entire time. That will really big time reduce the variance in the numbers. And you got intra-rater, so within raters variability. Well, just because you're testing the same person over and over again, make sure that you keep doing what you've always done. Okay, so if you are not paying attention somewhat while someone's running and you stop the clock a little too soon, a little too late, well, it may, fraction of a second may not seem, like a second may not seem much in the real world, but in sports, that matters a lot. So, point being, make sure that you're consistent with yourself and when you're testing and collecting these numbers on your athletes. Like I said, it's failure of the test itself to provide consistent results. Okay, so you want to make sure that you're not failing at all any time collecting, because then that could impact then, obviously not giving you the right numbers, but also, if you don't collect the right information, then you could be essentially prescribing your athletes an incorrect programming, which then over time could mean the difference between first and second place, even reaching the podium. Okay, so make sure when you're collecting numbers that you're having the right test for the right athlete. You're being consistent with the collecting of the data, and then make sure selecting a test that gives you consistent results, a reliable and valid test that gives you what you need to know in a consistent fashion. So intra-subject variability, so the lack of consistent performance by the person tested. You got inter-rater reliability, the degree which different raters agree, also referred to as objectively or intra-rater agreement. And then intra-rater variability, the lack of consistent scores by a given tester. So those are the key terms, once again, just to make sure you know the definitions on those, once again. That way you have those definitions there. So test selection, you got metabolic and biomechanical specificity. So for metabolic, consider the energy demands of the sport when choosing or designing a test. The old days of football, they say get in shape, go run 3 miles. Well, that's not a good test to test out ability on the football field. So now, in some ways they still don't really match up too much in the biomechanical patterns. I'll explain that here in a sec. A little bit more, I guess this goes to both, but for the combine, they do 225 bench as many times as possible. Same thing as military. Why do a test of endurance to test strength? Okay, so football players, though, a lot of them, what they do is they do like the pro drill, they do the 40-yard dash. Those are testing the metabolic demands of a football player. Now, I'd say in some ways, 40-yard dash is not really the best for a lineman, because a lineman runs, 5 to 10, maybe 15 yards. And so that's the pro agility drill, which I'll cover all those drills coming up later on. But pro drill is where you start off on the line, you sprint 5 yards, touch the line, and then you sprint through all the way across. Let me take that back. You have 2 cones 5 yards apart from you. You're on one line, and you have 1 cone 5 yards to the right, 5 yards to the left. So pro drill is where you start off and you run 5 yards, touch the line, and then you sprint 10 yards all the way through that second cone. So those type of drills are much more conducive to like a lineman than a 40-yard dash. Now, a receiver, 40-yard would be a good metabolic because that's all taxing those systems. Okay, so just when you're sending metabolically, just think of exactly, kind of what's going on in terms of the time and the specifics of the sport. Like a pro agility is good for linemen because they're only running that 5 to 10 yards. So they're really big time in the medial phosphagen system. Where a receiver might be going 40, 60 yards, given, the whatever the route they're doing. So they might, definitely going to be a lot longer than that 5 to 10, but they tap a little bit more metabolically, a little bit different. Not much, but somewhat different. And you think of a soccer player. Okay, a soccer player runs on average about 7 miles each match. So that's much different than the football player. So make sure you understand the energy systems for the athlete, which then help you get the specific test. And then you got the movement patterns, biomechanical movement patterns, and then so once again, I'll use football as another example. Running, 60 yards once again straight down the line is not the movement pattern of an offensive lineman. It would be for a receiver. And so a lineman could be doing some kind of testing with, the pads and doing a pushing drill of some kind. Those would be a lot more conducive to them as opposed to receivers. So kind of look at the movement patterns of the athlete along with the metabolic demands. Then you could figure out the right test to administer to kind of test them and keep making the progress with them. It says for a test to be valid, it must emulate the energy requirements and the improvement movements of the sport for which the ability is being tested. So just keep that in mind. So some things, take it apart, look at the experience and the training status. So consider the athlete's ability to perform the technique and the athlete's level of strength endurance training. Okay, when you're testing, if you're bringing a new group of athletes in, like tell them to do a clean or a snatch, it's like, well, their ability is not there if they're new. So that test is not going to be a very good, reliable, valid test for you because although those are a reliable and valid test for overall strength and athletic ability, you got to take into account the athlete's training status. So it's not going to give you the numbers you need to know on that. So, keep in mind how strong they are, what's their endurance, and their ability before you start just handing out different tests to be administered. Look at the the age and sex of the athlete. Okay, you could have older athletes, that is mature, we'll say mature athletes, do a lot more complex movements. Such as, if you're going to have them do testing aerobic ability, the 1.5 mile run would be a good test for them because they're mature and able to handle the stress. But you're not going to have, younger athletes, kids, run, go do that because they're not quite there yet. So you want to pay attention, like, okay, what's the age of my athlete? Because I'm not going to have freshman in high school who's never lifted before jump on the platform once again, the athlete's ability, and have them do the Olympic lifts. And also, we're looking at males and females. You're not going to have a group of females get up and do a chin-up test the same way you'd have, male wrestlers, for example, do a chin-up test. Okay, males have a much better upper body strength than females. And for most people, doing chin-ups are really hard. Pull-ups and chin-ups are difficult. But if you have like college wrestlers who have tremendous upper body strength, well, a chin-up or a pull-up test would be sufficient for them. But females not so much for that because they don't have the upper body strength that males do. So you wouldn't want them to go through that because then it's not going to give you any reliable, valid information. And pay attention to environmental factors. Okay, especially where we live in South Texas, we have heat and we've got humidity. So that's going to impose many risks onto tests, especially if you're doing an aerobic endurance test. Okay, that's going to really impact how well your athletes will be able to accomplish those tests. It says temperature fluctuations can reduce the ability to compare test results over time. So if you're testing athletes in August and you retest them in December, you're going to get, especially if you're doing an aerobic test, completely different numbers between the different times, probably just due in part to the environmental factors. And of course, altitude is going to impact as well, especially for aerobic test. Not for strength and power, that's not going to impact that, but it will for any kind of endurance testing. So don't test your athletes here and then have them go to the top of Pikes Peak in Colorado and have them do the same aerobic test, because it's going to be completely different. Okay, those are the key points. All right, I'm not going to cover those again. Just remember those key points right there. Beware of the health and safety of athletes. For instance, going back to the temperature or heat and humidity, beware that having your athletes do some kind of strenuous testing, because remember, when you're testing, it should be a test. It should be going all out. So you don't want to threaten them by putting them in a very stressful, they're already in a stressful situation because they're performing a test as maximally as possible, but then you throw in environmental, it just adds more stress to the body. So be careful of those factors. Be observant of signs and symptoms of health problems that warrant exclusion from testing. If they're not feeling well or something's going on, think of, anything that could warrant them from not testing, could hurt them. Just be cautious of all that. And then just make sure you observe before, during, and course after maximal exertions. Those who have had 401 or have seen the Wingate test, it's a 30-second maximal anaerobic power test on the cycle. If you see people perform that, after that 30 seconds, they get off, and there's a good chance they usually vomit because of just the stress on the body. Well, when that happens, you have them sit down and rest for 5-10 minutes, even maybe a little bit longer, to make sure that by the time they leave the lab, they're feeling okay. Okay, so just be cautious. Make sure they're getting some water in, getting some nutrition in definitely afterwards. Okay, so pay attention, because once again, I keep saying this, health and safety should be the number one priority for all coaches. So it says aerobic endurance testing in the heat. So make sure that they're leading up the weeks before, that they're actually training before they come in. Okay, don't bring in somebody who hasn't trained for a number of weeks and have them do a 1.5 mile run. Okay, of course, watch the environmental considerations. If it's hot and humid and you could test inside, get inside and test indoors. That'll help out. If you can't, then make sure your testing should be done in the morning or in the morning or evening hours. It should be acclimatized to the heat and humidity. It says for at least 1 week before testing. Make sure they're well hydrated going into testing. That's 24-hour period leading up to. And then make sure to drink enough fluids during the exercise in the heat. And wear appropriate clothing. So wear anything that says light colored, loose fitting tank tops, just because the light colored will help out with the radiation heat. Loose fitting will help out then with the evaporation, allowing for the material to dry, especially when you're sweating. And then make sure the shorts are kind of the same thing. Just make sure they're of a material that can help out with getting the heat out of you and getting it out into the environment. So here's just signs of heat stroke or heat exhaustion. You can see all those right there. Pretty noticeable signs definitely pretty noticeable signs of something's going on. It says, be aware of the symptoms of hyponatremia or water intoxication. Hyponatremia is low sodium. So sodium helps out with hydration. That's why Gatorade has salt. It's so salty, is because it does help out with hydration. Now Gatorade puts a lot in there due to trying to market it and trying to get more to be sold. But that being said, sodium does help out. So when you have hyponatremia or kind of water intoxication, you can see it says extremely dilute urine, bloated skin, altered consciousness, lack of consciousness, and no increase in body temperature. Okay, so you don't want to have body temperature get too high, obviously, but if your body temperature is not raising, then especially during exercise in the heat, well, that's a terrible sign. That's a sign that there's a dysfunction going on somewhere. Okay, so to help out with exercise and heat, make sure that what you're drinking does have some glucose in it and some sodium. Okay, because that'll then help out with the retention of fluids and helping out to maintain proper blood levels and hydration levels. And of course, medical cover should be readily available just in case. So selection training of testers says provide testers with practice and training, ensure consistency among testers, make sure you get people doing those are helping out know exactly what they're doing. That'll help out with getting the right numbers, but also help out with athlete safety, monitoring them. Experienced testers will see an athlete that could be having a major health problem and be able to respond probably quicker. So it says recording forms, make sure everything's done ahead of time. It says prepare scoring forms ahead of time to increase efficiency and reduce recording errors. Go into every single training session, every testing session, whatever, properly prepared. Have everything set up. That way you're able to get what you need. Don't be going in with like blank pieces of paper just writing at random. Just be prepared, be consistent, and that'll help out with all these processes. It says test format. Consider whether athletes will be tested all at once or in groups. It says the same tester should administer a given test to all athletes if possible. Each tester should administer one test at a time. So once again, just have everything laid out for the day. Make sure everything's planned out and you're organized and formal, and that'll help out with what it is you're trying to accomplish. Sometimes you can't test groups all at once, but testing like most football programs will do 110-yard. They'll do repeat 110s, so repeat 110-yard sprints, and most of them do 16, I believe. Some do in the 20s, but that's usually their a conditioning test leading into the season. And linemen, they call them bigs a lot of times. So like your lineman will have to do it in a certain amount of time. Then you'll have your mids, so like linebackers, fullbacks, they'll do a certain amount of time, and then your skill positions. So running back, quarterback, receivers, defensive backs, they'll have to do it in an even short amount of time. Well, that's something where you could have them all running at once, and they'll usually do 110 to do the 110 yards in a certain amount of time, minute rest, do it again. Well, you'll have coaches like, all right, you're watching just the bigs, you're watching the mids, and you're watching the skills. And so you could test them all at once that way. But just know, can this test be administered all at once, or can it be done in group, or be tested one at a time or in groups? And if you're doing batteries and multiple testing trials, it says duplicate test setups can be used for large groups. Just make sure it says allow at least 2 minutes of rest between attempts that are not close to athlete's maximum, 3 minutes between attempts that are close to maximum, and at least 5 attempts between test batteries. So you could test them. Just make sure you give everyone enough rest going into it all. So here, I kind of brought this up a little bit ago, looking at the test selection and making sure you're not having one that's going to impede upon one another. So here would be the sequence of tests if you're going to want to do a battery of tests on your athlete. So you start off first by doing non-fatiguing tests, so height, weight, flexibility, skin fold, vertical jump, something like that. That's not going to fatigue out at all. Then agility test, so you can do the T test, the pro agility test. And then from there you go to maximum power and strength, so 1 RM on the squat, 1 RM power clean. And you go sprint test, so it'd be like the 40-meter sprint. And from there you go to local muscle endurance test, so the push-up test, pull-up test. And then you go fatiguing anaerobic capacity, so this would be like the 300-yard shuttle, which if you haven't done that, it's horrible. But you set up cones 25 yards apart, and the shuttles, you do the back and forth until you get 300 yards. And so then you would do the aerobic capacity test, so 1.5 mile run, or the yo-yo intermittent recovery test. So you can see that these tests all go in ordering of from non-fatiguing all the way to the most fatiguing. And that way, each test, if you're doing them all, which, not every athlete needs to do all these tests, but just saying if you were, then you could keep going through without having one impacting the other. A lot of times, most athletes will do some of these tests. On days of testing, everyone's going to get their height and weight tested. If you're doing 1 RM, do the non-fatiguing first, then you go to the 1 RM. So for the most part of testing, you at least most coaches, most athletes will have at least some of these done all in the same day. And then we prepare the athlete for testing. Once again, be organized, be proficient, be formal. So announce the date, time, purpose going into this. Make sure your athletes kind of know why they're doing what they're doing. It helps out with rapport between the coach and athlete. Host a pre-test practice session. Make sure that they know when they're testing, they know what to do. You're not spending the entire time having to describe technique. Give clear and simple instructions. And that's really, for the most part, all strength and conditioning can be summed up as that. Okay, when you're coaching athletes, going over with them, just give them simple. It doesn't take long before they zone out. So when you're giving instructions, whether you're doing testing here or if you're teaching technique, keep it simple and clear and to the point. And don't give the lessons only as good as a level of comprehension of the athlete. Okay, so most times what coaches do, the biggest problem I've seen is they overcoach. Okay, just simple, clear. Just that helps out, and they'll get it pretty quick. If you go elaborately, start explaining every little thing, they'll zone out. It says demonstrate proper test performance. Organize a pre-test warm-up. Tell athletes their test scores after each trial, and administer a supervised cool-down period. So overall, the entire thing right here is that you have the athlete's interests at hand. You're being organized, you're being formal, telling them what, when, where, how, all the ins and outs of the testing, and you're monitoring them the entire time. Giving them proper warm-up, allowing them to test, and then giving them a cool-down. Making sure they know what they're testing. Make sure they know what to do. The last thing they need when you're testing is you screaming and yelling at them because they're not doing it right. If that's the case, make sure you explain yourself properly. Okay? Just because you see, a lot of times even in academics, I've noticed that as a professor, sometimes you get frustrated, but you always need to look at yourself. Like, did I do the right job? Did I explain it properly? Okay, it's not always a student and always the athlete's fault. So make sure they know what's going on, you're clear, you're concise, and you have their interests all at hand from warm-up to testing and then to a cool-down. And that's just the last point. The order test should be designed in such a way that the completion of one test does not adversely affect performance in subsequent tests. The goal of this is to give a clear picture of what athletes you have, what you're working with, and their abilities, and then how then to address what needs to be addressed. That is, we need to work on strength, we need to work on endurance, we need to work on this or that. So giving you an idea, knowing what to do, that way you could start then accomplish that, working on that, and getting the athletes ready to go for their season for competition. To conclude, like we talked about, we test and evaluate athletes because we want to see where they're at, what are their abilities. And then from there, the numbers we get, where can we make improvements? Where can we grow? What are the program needs to be adjusted? Okay, so at all times, coaches are testing and evaluating athletes. Now, this chapter is talking about the formal ways to test it, but really, as a strength coach, you're always testing and evaluating because you're looking at athletes like, oh, they're making progress here. We can maybe change up the intensity. We could add maybe this exercise, or you're constantly adding that new stimulus in to keep them growing. So you're always doing some form of testing and monitoring throughout the entire program. At least you should be. But this chapter, remember, is kind of looking at the overall, the formal way. Okay, doing the pre-test, mid-test, post-test. Doing tests are valid and reliable. That is, testing, you're having an athlete go through a test that's actually going to measure what it is you want to measure with reliability. Okay, performing a test that's going to give you consistent, valid numbers, minimizing variance as much as possible. I want to test strength, test power. I'll have the athlete do Olympic lifts. I'm not going to have them do a 1.5 mile run unless I want to test aerobic power. Okay, and so just make sure when you're testing that you're actually hitting the needs of the athlete, performing tests that are actually going to be specific to them and actually going to enhance their ability. And then that way you're getting an idea where they're at, and then be able to know how to then evaluate the numbers and then adjust, program up, readjust, whatever it needs to be to keep the athletes performing, growing, and developing. That way they could be the best they can in their competition, which is only going to come from the proper programming, the proper understanding of where they're at, and their abilities that they possess as an athlete.